So far we've talked a lot about the origins of religion, but for this lecture I want to talk about the future of religion. Making predictions about the future of religion has been generally a loser's game. So a lot of people, a lot of smart people, like Voltaire and like Jefferson and like Karl Marx and like Sigmund Freud, have all gotten this spectacularly wrong. So in the middle of the 18th century, Voltaire said that religion was going to be gone in about 50 years. Jefferson said, there is not a young man in the Union right now who will not die a Unitarian. That didn't happen. So then Karl Marx, who's famous for making bad predictions, said that religion would fade away as we approached modernity because it was no longer needed, replaced by the proletariat revolution, which is of course coming any moment now. And Freud made a similar prediction in his The Future of an Illusion, that religion would fade away as we move further into modernity. Now here we are in modernity and religion is still here. But what all these guys lacked is data. And we now have data, and does that help us make predictions about where religion is going? Well, let's look at what the data say. What about in the United States? Well, here we're lucky because Gallup has been keeping statistics going back to the 1950s. Now, if you look at this chart, it tracks the proportion of people who support the idea that religion is either very important or fairly important or not at all important to their lives. Now, the most obvious thing you can see from this chart is that the proportion who say that it's very important far exceeds the proportion who says that it's not at all important. But you can see that it's been narrowing. Now, in the latest data from 2015, that figure for people who say that religion is very important has fallen a little further down to 52%. And across that 60-year time span, the proportion of people who say that religion is not at all important has quadrupled. From 1953 to 2016, the percentage of people in the United States who've been willing to say that they don't believe in God at all has risen from 1% to 10%. And recall Will Gervais' data, which suggests that the actual number, when you account for response biases, might be 2 to 3 times larger than that. Now, in that same time period, the percentage of people who, when asked what religion they affiliate with, have indicated none, so no affiliation, has increased from 1% to 17%, so more, which is a lot. Now, that trend, like a lot of trends, has been led by young people. Okay, so here's a chart which breaks down non-affiliation by generation. And as you can see, each generation has a greater percentage of unaffiliated people than the previous generation. That culminates with people born after 1990, among whom 36%, so over a third of the population, indicate that they have no affiliation whatsoever, that their affiliation is none. And we know that's not a lifespan effect. So we know that religiosity does follow a life course, where people become less religious in late teenagehood and young adulthood, and then become more religious as they get married and have kids and then approach death. However, even accounting for that, you can see that young people today are less religious than young people of previous generations. So in other words, a 20-year-old now is more likely to be non-religious than a 20-year-old in 1990 or 1970 was. So what is responsible for this decline? Well, of course, there are several reasons. One big one is that, at least when we film this, life in America has gotten a lot better, even though it doesn't always seem like the case. So though it's the case that real incomes have stalled, those measures don't always capture other ways that living standards have improved. And as we talked about in a previous lecture, the benefits of religion tend to be more pronounced when life is difficult. So this gives credence to Marx's observation, which, though it hasn't come fully true, it is the case that the palliative functions of religion become obviated as life gets easier. So as life becomes easier, religion becomes less necessary. Another complex of reasons is the general decline of social organizations and a general loss of confidence in institutions. So across the board, Americans have lost confidence in things like schools or newspapers or businesses or the Supreme Court. The only institution that's seen a bigger drop in confidence than the church is Congress. Meanwhile, the sociologists Robert Putnam and Charles Murray have observed how large portions of the population have just stopped going to church. And as we talked about before, when children see their parents not attending church, not walking the walk of religion, not showing the credibility-enhancing displays in their commitment to faith, it makes it easier for people to just wander away from the faith entirely. Another fascinating explanation, which has been advanced by Putnam and his collaborator David Campbell, is that the rise of the religious right has pushed a lot of mostly liberals away from their affiliations with the church. So people who otherwise would have, when asked what their religious affiliation was, said, "Oh, put me down as Christian," when they see Christianity entwined with the religious right, they don't want to be associated with that. So then instead of saying nominally that they're Christians, they would rather say none than say that they're affiliated with a group that they see associated with the political side that they don't identify with. Now, whatever the combination of reasons, there is a clear, unmistakable trend of a decline of religiosity in Europe and in the United States. But it would be hasty to conclude that this means that there's a decline in religiosity in the whole world, especially when we have yet to take into account a very important factor, which is fertility. So given declining birth rates across the industrialized world, differential rates of reproduction, differential rates of fertility are going to reshape our demographic future. And one of the biggest factors that's going to be involved in that reshaping is religion. So the most fertile countries tend to be the most religious countries, and the most fertile people within countries tend to be the most religious people there. That means we're producing a lot more children within religious families than we're producing children within non-religious families. In 2015, the Pew Research Center published a massive document which outlined their predictions for the future of religion based on these demographic trends. It's not that Pew predicts that there's going to be an absolute decline in the number of religiously unaffiliated people. They actually predict that that number is going to go up by 100 million people, so 3 Canada's worth of people. It's going to move from currently 1.13 billion to 1.23 billion. But as a proportion of the world's global population, that's actually going to represent a decline in the percentage. And the reason for that is that most of the growth is going to happen in Asia and especially in Africa. Both Christianity and Islam are alive and well and very fertile in these parts of Africa and Asia. All that means is that in the absence of a big cultural change and a rapid secularization of places like Africa, which may happen, Christianity will grow from its current 2.2 billion people to 2.9 billion people. That keeps it at an even 31% of the global population. Islam, on the other hand, will double from 1.6 billion people, where it is now, to 3.2 billion people, which means it'll increase from its current 23% of the population to 30%. And it'll keep increasing such that it nudges out Christianity as the world's biggest religion by 2070. There's this famous quote by Yogi Berra, which is that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And the cardinal rule about making predictions is to work on a timescale that's long enough so that you won't be around to blame if and when they don't come true. But the problem with making these long-term predictions is that as the time frame increases, so do the uncertainties. Now, Pew explicitly notes that in their analysis, they didn't take into account the possibility that economic development or other forms of development would lead to secularization. They admit the possibility that such development would mean that they're underestimating the growth of unaffiliated people. However, they do caution that that connection between increased economic development and secularization is not a cardinal rule. It's occurred in some places, but it's also not occurred in other places. At the moment, African nations are not only the fastest growing demographically, but also the fastest growing economically. Whether the African nations follow the path of, say, the Gulf states and increase in wealth while remaining devout, or whether they follow the path of Europe, where as they become more economically successful, they become more secularized, that remains to be seen. But one wonders about what nascent atheist movements are springing up south of the Sahara.
بتسلم تملت شون دخمل سكارن ورينا قل دخكم باس ورن دكل لكوتا يا فنانني كنا بسمغارم من كوتا يا فنانني